Hello fellow 3D enthusiast, my name is Ian, and today I wanted to share with you a couple of techniques that I use to make this look like it is an underwater scene. And of course you can be adding in seaweed and crazy lily pads that are sci-fi or whatever, and lots of sand on the bottom, but there are a couple of things that you can add to a scene that will actually really push that over the edge to make somebody believe that that's definitely an underwater scene. And I've got that right here. As you can see, after I turn off that collection, it looks kind of just like it's nighttime or something. But when we click that back on, we've got the volumetrics and the bubbles. And those are the two things that I'm going to be going over with you today. So let's hop into a different scene. Alright, this is my starting scene. I've just got the ground, I've got a sun lamp set up and a camera, and I've set my background to be black, so it's fairly easy to get to this point. So I'm going to start with my volumetrics. What I'm going to do to get that started is just add in a cube and go Alt-G, so that's in the center of the world here. I'm just going to scale that up to be around the size of my scene that I want. We take this up a little bit and scale it down on the Z-axis. We get something a little bit more to the level of water that I would like. And this box is basically going to surround everything that you would like to be underwater. If we go up here and hop into the shading tab, we can start to work on the material of this box here. If we go new, and then just delete this principled shader with X, don't really need that. The two shaders that we do need that I'm going to use here is a volume scatter and an emission shader. So I'm just going to go Shift A, shader, volume scatter, and I'm also going to go Shift A, shader, and emission. You can tell that the shortcut to get an emission shader is E because that letter is underlined in here, or D for diffuse, A for add. You can see how that works. But I'm just going to hit E real quick, then we have our emission shader. And if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, you can just hit Control and Shift and right click and drag between these, and that will mix them together. Alright, this is a pretty good start. Let's take our shader output here and put that into the volume input of the material output. And if we go render view, I'm doing this in Eevee by the way, if we go render view, we can see that we have this massive light box. Let's take that down to something like a 0.1 for the strength of the emission shader, and then for density, we're going to do something similar to that. Let's just try 0.1 for now. So for the emission, I've just bumped that down another decimal, and we've got something that looks alright here. What I'd like to show you right now is another thing that's really cool, and that will really help this look a lot more like water in a second here. I'm going to build out a few nodes here, and I'm going to start by hitting Shift A, Input, and Texture Coordinate, then Shift A, Vector, and Mapping. And I'm also going to get a converter, and then separate X, Y, Z. Now if we drop these all here, we're going to plug them in like so. Generated just goes into the vector in the top here. And then this vector will go into that one. And if we take a look at this with Node Wrangler, Control Shift and click, what we have here is a gradient that goes from black at the bottom to white at the top, which we can also affect if we go Converter and Color Ramp. Now we can change the level where that goes. If we want it to be up here and we don't like this sharp line, then we can just switch linear to be ease, and that gets a little bit softer. So I would actually like this color ramp to be colors rather than just black and white. So what I'm going to do here with this darker value is actually just turn that all the way up and get something kind of aqua looking like this. And then on the other side of the spectrum, I'm just going to go for kind of a light blue. Now with this color ramp, I'm just going to plug this into the color of the volume scatter and the color of the emission. And I'm going to delete this viewer node so that nothing is plugged into surface and it's all just going into the volume. Crap. Okay, look at that. That seems like a little bit much at the second. So we can mess with the saturation of our colors if we want. Just make this a little bit less saturated. There we go. And also we can change the level at which it gets to be this more aqua color by bumping down the blue if we want it more blue. Or we can make that go up higher if we just crank up this value here. So you have a lot of nice control going on there. I'm still not super happy about how light this is, and I would like it to be a little bit more dense. So I'm going to bump the density to a 2, and I'm also going to knock this down a notch, add in another 0, and go 0.5. Let's try that. Okay, this is something that I like a little bit more. Alright, cool, that's step 1. So we got this volume going on. Step 2 is to add in a whole bunch of bubbles, which generally would signify that you're underwater, right? So what I'm going to do to get bubbles, I'm going to go back into my solid shading with Z and go to solid. So the way I'm going to get bubbles is kind of counterintuitive. I'm just going to start by adding in a cube. And if I grab this and go over here, period on the number pad to zoom in, and if we go to layout, we can see that a little bit better. So with this cube, what I'm going to do is hit tab and go into edit mode, right click and subdivide, maybe 3 times. And now to make it a bubble shape, I'm going to go Shift, Alt, and S. And then I'm going to drag my mouse to the right. So we have a nice little quad sphere here. I'm going to right click once more and go Shade Smooth, so that's nice and smooth looking. And I'm going to go into modifiers. Here I'm going to add in a displace modifier, go New Texture, and hit this little panel over here. That will take us to the texture properties. I'm going to get a clouds texture, and I'm just going to turn up the scale of that quite a bit. All the way up to 2 works. So now I'm going to go back to the modifiers and just turn down the strength to maybe a 1.2, something like that, so that we see a little bit of a regular shape, but it's also pretty spherical. Now here comes the fun part. I'm going to change local here in the texture coordinates to be global. And now if we grab this sphere and move it around, you can see that the shape is changing. Or maybe you can't see that. Let's turn up the strength a little bit. Yeah, look at that. So the cool thing about this is, if we take it back down to like maybe a 0.3, the cool thing about this is if we duplicate it with Shift D and move it over, that gets a completely different variation of a bubble, and it's not super noticeable, but also it is fairly noticeable if you just have one and they're all over the place and they look exactly the same. So let's just get a few different variations by hitting Shift D. Alright, nice. I'm going to box select that, just drag the mouse over them all and hit M and go New Collection. Okay, so we got our collection of bubbles here. I'm going to minimize that up here in the outliner, and what I'm going to do now is set up a particle system that will consistently emit these right around the range of the camera so that it looks like they're always coming up. And my little trick for doing this is actually to go Shift A and create a plane. I'm going to scale that up quite a bit so we get a good area, but it doesn't have to be huge and cover the whole scene. I'm going to toggle X-ray with Z and then toggle X-ray. And I'm just going to kind of center this right in front of the camera. And if we grab this on the Z axis and drag it down a little bit, that's pretty nice. I'm going to keep that underneath the surface of the floor, just so that bubbles come out of that. Now with the plane selected, I'm going to select the camera by hitting Shift and left mouse button and go Control P. That will parent the object, and when we move around the camera, the plane moves around with it. Cool. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is set up a particle system that will emit these bubbles from this plane all the time, or at least consistently throughout the scene. So let's go into the particle settings here on the side panel and hit this plus button up here. If we play the animation, you can see they're all falling, and that's not really great. So we're going to set up a few properties here that are going to be pretty useful. I'd say 1000 is alright for the number at the moment, but I'm going to switch the end frame to be 250 since that's the end of our scene. And also, one thing that I'm going to do is change the field weights so that gravity does not affect our bubbles. In fact, if you wanted to, you can mess around and go -1, then you have negative gravity, which I don't think we want at the moment, but that's pretty cool in case you ever want to do that. Just going to set that to 0 for now. We can minimize our field weights, and if we restart the animation, play it all over again, bubbles are slowly rising up and then disappearing way too soon. So the way we fix this so that they actually go up all the way is we extend their lifetime. So over here in the emission settings, if we change 50 to something closer to 250, that'll give them a chance to go quite a bit farther in life. And you can see they're all just starting to rise up like this. And if we move our camera around, they will be emitting pretty much the same place as our camera is, which is handy. You probably wouldn't want to go too crazy with the camera movements because eventually they'll just disappear, but I'd say that's a fairly good setup for slow moving cameras. Okay, so these are our bubble settings so far. Let's just keep working on this a little bit. For velocity, I think I'm probably going to go a little bit faster than that, maybe 2 meters per second. And if we restart, start over again, Yeah, that seems like a realistic bubble speed, but I don't think I want crazy busy stuff like this going on, so I'm just going to turn it down to 1.5. And a little trick here, if you want this to actually start having bubbles before your scene starts, you can set the frame start to be, instead of 1, you could set it to be like -50, something like that. And when you start your scene, they'll all just be up already. Maybe -70 would work better, actually. There we go. Nice. Okay, so these spheres that you're seeing at the moment are not actually our bubbles rendering right now. So we're going to have to change that so that they are in fact our bubbles. If we go back to our particle settings here for a second, we don't need velocity. And if we go to render, this is actually the objects that we're going to be using. Instead of render as halo, we're going to be going render as collection. And everything disappears because we don't have a collection set yet. So let's go collection, bubbles, noise. And with this, a cool thing is you can actually switch up the scale, so we can make those pretty big if we want. And also we can turn up the scale randomness, which will help quite a bit. Now we have all these random sizes. That's cool. Honestly, to me this seems like a bit much, so I'm going to turn it from 1000 to maybe 600. And if we restart our animation, there we go. Alright, that's looking pretty good so far. The biggest glaring issue I can see right now is that these are not very subtle. They're all big, like giant white orbs, which is because we just don't have any material set on them right now. That's alright, we can set up a material real quick. I'm going to select this corner. Let's hop into the shading tab and go new material. So our principled shader here is pretty good. Let's just turn down the roughness all the way because bubbles are actually pretty smooth. And the other thing I'm going to do is set up a transparent shader. So shader, transparent. And once again, if we hold Control and Shift and right click and drag between those with Node Wrangler, we get a nice mixed shader. And if we reorganize that a little bit, let's go Shift A, Input, and Fresnel. And this node is pretty cool. If you view it, this is what it looks like. We've got darker towards the camera, and then on the edges, it looks a little bit whiter, which is pretty handy. If we grab this and drop that into the factor, it doesn't really do anything. And that's because if we look into our material settings, for blend mode of our alpha channel, it's set to opaque, which means basically there is none. So if we go to alpha blend, that starts to look a little bit better, but it's also crazy funky at the moment. So the fix for this is to check show back face, and that tends to work pretty well. Nice. So we have our first bubble here. It's a little bit strange still. Let's just turn this value down a tiny bit. That way you just get the very edges, and that's pretty nice. Okay, so this bubble has the material, none of the other ones do. So if we select all, just click and drag, and then select this one as the active selection, which is the last thing you select, and then go Control L, we can hit materials, and then they will all have that material. Nice. Look at all these bubbles. Cool. Now if we go back to camera view, you can see they are all here indeed. Now I'll admit, this definitely isn't perfect. You'd probably want to fine-tune the particle settings a little bit, but those are two pretty massive elements that will go into all of your underwater scenes. Okay, so the third element you're probably going to want in your ocean scene is fish, which you can see I have a few of here. And I'm not actually going to tell you how to do this because somebody other than me did a better job of making a tutorial on how to do that, and that is Ian Hubert. I'll make sure that I link in the description to his tutorial. It's 1 minute, super funny, super fast, and super informational. So I really recommend that. But if you look here, if we grab this lead fish, they all swim around with it, which is a really easy setup to make, and it's super cool. So that is pretty much it for this tutorial. If you found it helpful and you're interested in seeing more tutorials like it, there is a link in the description that says Free Hydraulic Kit Bash Elements. And what happens when you click that link is it will sign you up for my email list, and I'll make sure the first thing I send you is a pack of Hydraulic Kit Bash Elements for Blender, and then whenever I upload a tutorial, I just mail out to that list to make sure everybody is up to date and can see what's going on. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you have an excellent day, and cheers!